So there's a photograph. Before I get into stuff about Boris Johnson, which I will, I promise, there's a photograph of Mrs. Thatcher shaking hands with Menachem Begin. And why is this relevant? Because Mrs. Thatcher had said that she would never shake hands with a terrorist. Now, here is a photograph of Thatcher shaking hands with Menachem Begin. She's shaking hands directly with a terrorist, and there's no doubt about it at all. Menachem Begin, the seventh Prime Minister of Israel, the sixth Prime Minister of Israel, was a terrorist. He joined an organization called the Irgun. He was the key organizer of the Irgun terrorist attack on the King David Hotel in 1946, which killed 91 people, 28 British people, 40 Palestinian Arabs, and 28 or something Palestinian Jews. And he was, as I say, the sixth Prime Minister of Israel from 1977 to 1983, during the time that Thatcher was Prime Minister. He joined the Irgun, also called Etzel, the National Military Organization, in what was then Palestine, which was occupied by the British Mandate. Britain was tasked with looking after the Palestine-Israel area during the period after the First World War as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, that appalling treaty which directly, really, was responsible for the Second World War, the rise of Hitler. You just simply have to read the economic consequences of the peace by John Maynard Keynes. And it was simply the result of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War that led to Britain taking control from 1920 to 1948, a poisoned chalice. And Begin, as leader of Etzel in 1946, ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was also the headquarters of the British administration. 91 people died, 41 Palestinians, and 17 Palestinian Jews, 28 British people, a few soldiers, a lot of administrative staff. But it's not only that. I mean, that if there was just one terrorist event, then maybe you say, oh, it's just once. No, it wasn't once. It was at least two occasions when Begin attacked the British in Palestine. The other occasion was known as the Sergeant's Affair in 1947. He ordered the killing of 2 British soldiers as retribution for the execution of 3 Etzel members by the British forces. The British soldiers were hanged and their bodies were booby-trapped. So even in death it wasn't, there was no peace. Etzel was disbanded in the late 1940s, and Begin then turned to politics. He founded the Herat party, and that eventually became the Likud party, and founded specifically with the idea that the slogan was undermined from the river to the sea, with the idea of settlements, with the idea of the abolition of Gaza and so on. And Begin, nevertheless, was awarded the Joint Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, with Mohammed Anwar al-Sadat. So demonstrating, despite Thatcher's prejudice, that a terrorist can become a peace holder, can change. Demonstrating that, as we saw in Northern Ireland, terrorists can be reformed, but it doesn't stop them being terrorists. And history will record the fact that they had birth enmired, their political birth was enmired in blood. We see this in Northern Ireland. We see this in Palestine, in Israel. And no doubt the future leaders of the Palestinian state will also have their hands dirtied. But there's a difference between rhetoric and casual speech and what people do. So there are photographs of Thatcher meeting Menachem Begin, and yet she said she would never shake hands with a terrorist. And when did she say that? When did she say that? She said it a number of times, but specifically there was a time when she was in the lobby of number 10, and it was at the point when Rhodesia was about to become Zimbabwe, and she stopped and said to her private secretary, "I'm not going to shake hands with the hands of terrorists." And she was talking about Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, and yet 10 minutes later she was in Lancaster House shaking hands with Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. So what we say is not necessarily what we mean, but if we are a prime minister, every word is taken seriously. When she shook hands with Begin, it was in 1979, and she was with Lord Carrington, and the experience really didn't go very well at all. Asriel Beaumont, in a book, Margaret Thatcher in the Middle East, says that it was a disaster, that she had been unsympathetic towards Begin from the outset. Of course she had, because of his record of violence during the British Mandate. Nevertheless, the encounter, he says, instilled in her a strong dislike for the settlement policies espoused by the Likud party. And the settlement policies, by the way, are the little bit that we're not talking about at the moment in the West Bank, that we should be talking about, because that is still going on, and the settlement activists are attacking Palestinians who disagree, and indeed they attacked, indeed that sort of spirit is behind the Arab attack, the Palestinian attack of Mahmoud Abbas yesterday. The violence breeds violence, and anyway, Thatcher apparently said to Giscard d'Estaing, the French president, that regarding Menachem Begin, that she had never had a more difficult man to deal with. And that brings us to Boris Johnson and the idea, did he actually say, "But let the bodies pile high"? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Lord Lister confirms that he actually said that. But more than that, he also said, as we learnt yesterday, that he wanted to be injected with COVID-19 on television as a demonstration to encourage the others. An unfortunate comment. Of course. Now, you could say, oh, yes, well, Boris just likes testing the water, and that his real focus was on trying to avoid a further lockdown. And, of course, Boris could say, he never said, let the bodies pile high. Total rubbish. But that may not have been what he intended or what he wanted, because I think Boris belongs to that group of people who likes to test ideas by vocalizing them. An idea comes into his mind, and he's unable to restrain it from getting out of his mouth. But as Prime Minister, the things which come out of his mouth are registered, recorded, and repeated regularly. And the things which come out of his mouth define him. So the I would go on even further, and I would say that even Brexit was something where it was just an idea in his head which he was testing, and maybe he came to the point where he had no choice but to go through with it, not unlike his marriages. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for Simon Case to say that these people are mad. They're just madly self-defeating. I've never seen a bunch of people less well-equipped to run the country. Well, yeah, pot and kettle calling black. But Helen McNamara last week talked about a toxic culture, a macho culture, and Lord Lister confirms that. He says, I think there's a lot of tension taking place, and that Dominic Cummings was not an easy man to deal with. What this COVID inquiry is not the best inquiry that we could have. It's it's very that the kid gloves are on all the time, but at the same time, we are learning and confirming a series of facts which we suspected. These are now facts, and Boris Johnson's government was clearly extremely ill-equipped to deal with such a national emergency. And Boris Johnson himself, as one of the people has pointed out, was probably, I think it was Dominic Cummings, not the ideal person for that sort of catastrophe. But prime ministers are defined by events, and some of them, like Thatcher, a glory in the events, in the chance happenings, and that defines them. And some of them, like Johnson, fail at that point. That defines them. Or Liz Truss, or Theresa May. All of these, I think, will go down in history